Welcome to the session on brain cities. This is the 10th in the series of our FIU DDES program, the theories of the digital, looking at the way in which architectural intelligence and AI in particular is going to have an impact on the way that we operate as architects. Today's session, I'm delighted to have two guest speakers. Firstly, Namjoo Lee, an architectural designer, researcher and lecturer, who's been the principal of NJ Studio since 2004, specializing in architecture, computational design and visualization. He graduated from Seoul National University of Science and Technology, then UC Berkeley for a master's and Harvard GSD for an MDes. And he works in the integrative and interdisciplinary domain of the built environment and technology, with a particular interest in computational design and visualization. Central to his practice is the use of data as a primary methodology in shaping a design process by integrating computation and visualization. I'm also joined by my colleague Dianna Bogosian, my very distinguished colleague Dianna Bogosian, who is just been appointed not so long ago an assistant professor at Florida International University. She is central to many things in the world of architecture and computation. She's been on she's a central part of Digital Futures, has been for many years. She's also on the board of Acadia. She's a graduate of first of all Woodbury University and then Columbia GSA APP. And now she's just wrapping up a PhD at USC in the IMAP program, the Interdisciplinary Media Arts and Practice in the cinema school there. And she's also, as I say, assistant professor of architecture at FIU. She's also been very highly successful in getting grants, NSF grants, working with my colleague Shaheen Vasik. It's great to have two such distinguished speakers for today's session. Today's session will actually be divided up into effectively two sections. The first one will be about the informational city and the ways of architects will operate using information within the informational city. And towards the end, we'll be opening up the question about brain city, to what impact AI is going to have on the way that cities operate in the future. So last week, we were looking at the question about the swarm and swarm intelligence. And this image of the flocking of birds, which has led to a whole sort of new way of thinking, what we call swarm intelligence, and which has a huge impact on the way that architects operate. In many ways, the swarm is kind of central to many of the debates here. And I think it goes beyond the way it's been used as simple architectural form to talk about, in a very intelligent way, how society itself operates, especially aspects of the economy and so on. So it's a very powerful metaphor that also comes to stand in many ways for the way that we, as a group, the DDES hopefully will be learning together. It also opens up the question about the brain. The idea somehow there is a connection between multi-agent systems, between ants, brains, cities, and software that feeds directly into today's session. So, and last week I'm showing you here the work of Dianna Bogosian, who wasn't able to come, unfortunately. He had a domestic crisis, had to pull out at the last moment. But he is, in addition to being one of the leading figures in terms of AI, responsible for Deep Himmelblau, for Wolf Bricks at Corp Himmelblau, has also been one of the central figures looking at multi-agent systems, swarm intelligence, and looking at how we can use those in architectural arenas. And the idea of today of the kind of the brain also, I'd say, is central to how this panel seems to have evolved and is developing. Being able to bring in distinguished authorities on AI from across the world together on one platform has led to a new mode of operation that I've not seen before. The idea of the very immediate feedback you can get from bringing together all these individuals in proximity. It's not that we didn't have the possibility of feedback before, but the immediacy of the feedback, I think, has opened up a new domain of looking at how we can think about educational platforms as being a kind of global brain where, provided we operate at the right time, we can bring everyone together. So these are the kind of the thoughts from last week, which really, in many ways, feed into today's session. And just to kind of to reiterate the kind of genealogy of literature in the field, in 1999, the first book, to my mind, the first book that came out exploring the notion of swarm intelligence, written by three scientists, a very eminent scientist working at Santa Fe Institute, Eric Bonobo, Marco Dorigo, Guy Terrales, all of them from Europe. And they produced this astonishing book, which, from a scientific point of view, really opened up a new way of thinking about how we could operate swarm intelligence from natural to artificial systems. It was written, though, somewhat as a kind of like a scientific discourse, and it took the publication of Stephen Johnson's emergence, in fact, on the very day of 9/11, and he lived in New York himself, to really bring these ideas to a general public. Stephen Johnson is a popular science writer, and he was able to kind of massage and represent in many ways these very scientific ideas in a narrative that made sense to a lot of people. And this has become a very important book, a bestseller that makes available these ideas to the general public. And then finally, the swarm intelligence book that Architectures of Multi-Agent Systems that Roland and I put together, initially for 2010, but then the publication was delayed until 2017. But that kind of in many ways covers swarm intelligence and the impact on architectural design. There are some extraordinary designs in the book, and it was focusing primarily on that rather necessarily than intelligent systems and the way in which we might take swarm intelligence and understand the city through the logic of swarm intelligence. And that in many ways is what we're going to be doing today. But just to show some of the illustrations of work by my colleague Roland Snooks, the kind of formal studies or studies of form that are emerging through using multi-agent systems. What is remarkable at how the kind of formal similarities between these kind of forms generated using multi-agent systems and the logic of the brain itself, the neural networks and the pathways and so on. And it's no coincidence because they're based on the same logic itself. So today, in some ways, we're going to take another aspect of the kind of the subtitle of Stephen Johnson's book, The Connected Lives of Ants, Cities, Brains and Softwares, to look at actually how software, and particularly AI, might have an impact on the city within the broader context of other informational systems which have been used to both analyze and also to in the design process to generate cities. So this is the 10th in the series of these sessions. It's in a way, it brings to an end to some extent the kind of it's the final one in terms of the applications of AI within the design process. The next session will be about material intelligence, looking at how we also need to take into account other forms of intelligence. Last week it was biological intelligence, and then next week we're looking at not so much maybe material intelligence per se, but the intelligent use of materials. And then finally, the concluding session on the death of the architect, looking at in some sense, the negative impact of this explosion of these new technologies. So brain cities with the term AI in brackets. This will be the section, in a way, I'll be looking at the impact of AI most specifically in terms of how we control traffic flow and so on in our cities in the final section. So the question I want to start off, though, in terms of the role of computation and informational systems in terms of our cities, is what will the cities of the future look like? Will the city of the future look something like this, something out of Jetson with all these extremely technologically advanced buildings, a kind of futuristic landscape with flying cars, a kind of Blade Runner on steroids, a vision of a completely new and totally futuristic vision? Or will it look much like the city of today? And this is a view of Los Angeles. Will it look much like the city of today with much of the existing stock, if not all of the existing stock, retained, with a few individual buildings added, and no doubt futuristic in the language that they use, but on the whole, looking largely the same as it does today, but with all the old buildings retrofitted with the latest technology, and the city itself controlled by the use of AI. Well, certainly it's my view that it's likely to be the latter. But I wanted to refer back to a book that came out, an issue of Architectural Design that was published in 2009, one that I guest edited on the digital city. And it's interesting to kind of speculate about what vision was around 12 years ago now about what the city of the future would look like. And on the front cover, a vision of Istanbul, a design by Zaha Hadid Architects, looking at a whole-scale project to introduce what Patrick Schumacher has called parametricism at an urban scale. In fact, this was the article where he initially broached the subject or raised the topic of parametricism as a polemic. He went on to then produce his own AD on parametricism and has been a champion of the concept ever since. The idea that there will be a new global style for architecture and urbanism based on the logic of parametric. And of course, there have been a number of the number of studies that done by that office, which have really been groundbreaking in many ways. This was this was
с удовольствием.
Like, Eleanor, could you possibly mute yourself? This is a project for Singapore, but the first time that these computational tools were used to try and model the city of the future, and astonishing in the way that the kind of vision that it offered. There have been other ones. This is the one in Istanbul again. There was a project done by Zaha Hadid Architects for Soho in Beijing, again a large scale redevelopment of part of the city of Beijing. There was one project that was an exercise that was done for the East End of London, a huge area that was going to be. The vision was of a huge area of parametric urbanism. But it's also worth saying that despite that, the dynamism of that vision, we haven't seen that at an urban scale. We haven't seen a new city laid out according to the principles of parametricism. Although we have seen in terms of that office, I mean, a huge amount of buildings that collectively would constitute a whole city. And this is the project for Soho in Beijing in China by that office, and also their new airport, the largest airport in the world, which is truly enormous. So collectively, perhaps we might say that there has been a kind of enough buildings to constitute what we might call a parametric city in some senses, but we have not seen as such kind of the whole vision being articulated. This is the interior of the airport, and then a tower block again in Beijing itself. In retrospect, perhaps the most prescient article in the volume was by Ben Bratton. While others were talking about the new forms, the new language of this new the city of the future, the digital city of the future, Ben Bratton focused on a completely different thing. Instead of saying focusing on form, he was focusing on information and informational systems. And in his essay, iPhone City, he lays out this vision of how the city of the future is being transformed. The main driver of change is the simple iPhone or the simple cell phone, the mobile phone, which is completely changing the way in which we operate and navigate our cities. It's become a new way of thinking. And in these early days, this is 2009, he talks about how the iPhone has a huge impact whereby the car can become the office. And writing from LA, you get stuck in traffic jams, and no doubt this was the case. But of course, these days you're not allowed to use your phone. You're allowed to text messages while you're driving. But nonetheless, that was the concept that he was outlining, saying that this has completely changed the way that we operate. And I think that he is absolutely right. Again, speaking from LA, with streets that go on for many miles, you need to know exactly, be able to target the number of the street, know where it is, because Venice Boulevard can go on for about 10 miles. An address, it means nothing without an iPhone to be able to locate it. It's also made a huge difference in terms of how you might get around in terms of hailing a taxi, as it were. And Uber has had an astonishing impact on everything. I mean, just to say that Ben wrote his article 1 year before the first version of Uber was on the marketplace. He wasn't to know about Uber as such, and yet what is interesting about Uber is how it has transformed how we operate. And the focus again with Uber is not on form per se, but on informational systems. Contrary to the vision of someone like Mario Carpa, who thinks that there may be big data will produce a new style of architecture, a new messy style of architecture, I would argue that actually what big data and what AI offers us is not a new language of anything, but rather a new way of operating, a new process-based way of operating, where we rely upon informational systems. Does an Uber car look anything different to an ordinary car? No, it doesn't, because it is an ordinary car. It's simply harnessing these technologies to operate in a different way. So I personally think that Ben's vision was an astonishingly prescient one, and it's one that really has stood the test of time, and maybe in some senses is also beginning to dictate how the future of architecture itself will operate. So here I want to introduce the topic of the informational city. And this concept, of course, is not new. Manuel Castells wrote about this, I think, back in the 90s, looking at the way in which information would be the primary driver of change in our cities. And I think, well, it's clear that the network city is absolutely the way that we think about things these days. This was an extraordinary, also extraordinary vision of the future that was envisioned. The next step, in many ways, was Bratton himself, who takes that two-dimensional image, or the two-dimensional informational city that Castells is talking about, and thinks about it more in terms of three dimensions, what he calls the stack, the accidental megastructure that develops, whereby we can see our operations today in terms of a series of these kind of horizontal layers that stacked up vertically, that create a completely different sort of system, interconnected system, relying on cloud computing and so on, to produce another logic entirely, one that is kind of all-consuming and one that is dictating how we operate today. So the stack is something that is a vertical layered stacking of these systems one upon the other, that they're completely interconnected, that cities are connected with each other, and that different levels of the stack are connected with one another. And this is the diagram produced by Metahaven, the only diagram in the book, that talks about these 6 different layers, of which the city itself, the subject of today's discussion, is but one of 6 different layers. Again, an astonishing vision, and I really applaud the vision of Ben Bratton in many ways. And of course, we're familiar with the smart city. This has become increasingly an important debate, how we can use these technologies to improve the operations of our city. But I think what I want to envision today is one that goes a vision that goes beyond the smart city. And certainly Ben Bratton thinks that his vision of the stack goes beyond that notion of the smart city. One that is not simply kind of reliant on these technologies, but is one that is connected through the Internet of Things, and especially through the artificial Internet of Things, to produce something that we can possibly call the brain city. The argument being here that there's a possibility of not just of being the whole thing connected within a system, that like the neurons of the brain could be understood as one kind of interconnected totality that is open, that is following its own new intelligent logic. And of course, we've had many of these devices before. The Nest thermostat, which deploys machine learning to find more efficient ways in which we operate. Of course, we use the cell phone itself has been an extraordinary new way, as Ben himself has been saying, of changing the way that we operate in the city. And one of the other comments that Bratton makes, which I think is also extremely perceptive, is to say that, well, in a sense, the city is already colonized by AI in the form of our cell phones and the apps on our cell phones, and the city wears us just as we wear our devices. So in other words, these devices have already created a new landscape in which information technologies have begun to sort of overtake our city. And of course, there will be new buildings. And I don't want to kind of say that there will be no new buildings at all. Of course, there will be new buildings. And even some buildings, the data farms that we can find that are related to themselves to the use of these technologies. All I want to stress, though, is that we now have another very significant driver of change, and that is information itself. And alongside the information, the information of these systems, we have a new individual that I would call the information architect, a kind of variant on the architect of the past, that an architect who uses increasingly software and of various kinds to operate in a new way. And one of the concepts that came out of Bratton's, one of the comments made that Ben Bratton made in his essay on the iPhone City, and it was a comment that actually, in retrospect, doesn't really fit in, but has proved to be a kind of an astonishing provocation in its own right, and that is this one: the idea that that when he makes this statement at one point, which I don't know why he says it, but it's a very interesting and provocative statement. An experiment. One half of all architects and urbanists in the entire world should, as of now, stop designing new buildings and new developments altogether. Instead, they should invest the historical depth and intellectual nuance of their architectural imaginations into the design and programming of new software that provides for the better use of structures and systems we already have. It is a simple matter of good content and management. The other half of the control group may continue as before. And of course, it's also the harnessing of these technologies in the way that whatever new buildings are produced using intelligent systems to think about architecture in a new way. The one person I was thinking of when I was writing my book about this thing was about this subject. It's Brain City is the penultimate chapter in it. Is Shangruo. Shangruo is in many ways the archetypal kind of information architect. I mentioned her partly because she actually started off by working for Uber. She's an architectural graduate from Tsinghua and then from MIT, and has been working on tracking kind of using informational systems to visualize visualize data and to particularly visualize the way in which Uber operations were used. So this is a study, for example, that she did of San Francisco, looking at how the Uber cars that have been used there, and also this one of London, tracking the use of Uber cars. And she wrote an article for the architectural design issue, an issue of architectural design that was edited by Mark Burry, where she was looking at how the architect of the future can actually harness these technologies as a way of approaching the question of design itself. A kind of hybrid vision, a vision in which you kind of draw upon the information of these technologies, but also use your architectural imagination to deploy them in an interesting way. Rapid developments in spatial data mining, analytics, and visualization mean that urbanists now have a collection of open data, advanced tooling, and analytic models at hand to tackle complex urban issues. Granted that geospatial data has always been used in the planning process to facilitate the decision making, but it is the explosive volume, variety, and resolution of it, alongside increasing analytic capacity, that has fundamentally changed the notion of urban studies. She herself has now opened up a company that is called Unfolded, based in San Francisco, where she's using this kind of data mining to visualize things. And she wrote the software, so in many ways, to my mind, she was responding to this whole question. But it's not just Shangruo. There's a whole new generation, I would say, of informational architects who have been responding to this question. And I'd like to invite now Namjoo Lee to show some of his work as one of these kind of inspirational new figures who have seized upon this and have opened up new ways of operating. Namjoo, it's great to see you here. Would you like to share your? Let me just see to share your screen. Thank you.
So do you guys can see my screen?
Yes, fantastic.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you for having me here to have a presentation and great conversation with you guys about data and urban design. I am an architecture designer and founder of an NGA studio, which is about computation design and visualization works. And also I'm working at actually as a software engineer, which is GIS company. So I'm most of my presentation today is about how to dealing with the urban data. and the visualization tool by the technical aspect, I guess. Before we talk about like some examples, I would like to point out the system, because we are mainly dealing with the data, because urban is full of data, as thanks to development of technology of sensoring and computation power, like parallel processing to compute a lot of data to extract the insight. So we I would like to point out a system how to extract the data and then manipulating, and then revealing some insight from the data, and then how to implement your design practice. So there are three things I can talk about. Like, one is the data, because the urban contain different levels of the data in terms of the scale, and also we have the methodology to process the data. And then the last one, you can think about a system to wrapping up the pipeline from the extracting data to methodology. So because we are dealing with the data in spatial context, I would like to point out some methodology which is commonly widely used for not only for visualization, but also processing the urban data. So one is the graph system, which talk about like some discrete data in urban context. And the other one is the pixelated information, which is sort of two-dimensional, the area that discretize our city. And also we can deploy the voxel as a 3 dimension, so that we are able to incorporate multiple layers into the urban scale. So these are some of primary methodology that I used for the processing the urban data. And the system is more about like how we create a pipeline on the basis of the data structure like that. So it actually depends on what kind of data you want to manipulate. So what kind of process do you want to deploy, such as machine learning algorithm also has multiple different types of the network and purpose. So based on the purpose, I think we can design the system as a pipeline. So this is one of the examples that I did in the media lab and changing place. So what I did is extracting all the third place data from the Google map, and then map the data on the Cambridge area. And then based on the walkable distance, such as 5 or 10 or 15 minutes, we can extract the data, third place data, so that you can characterize the city, not just like the infrastructure-wise or the city that we already familiar with, but I would like to see the city as a lens of the third place based on the distance. So in this context, there are several techniques that I utilize. It's not only just the graph traversal technology, but also we can compact multiple layer into this the urban city. So such as like, let me move a little bit. Such as not only the physical information on top of the city, but also we can compact like economic or social data into multiple layers. So basically, we can rely on the multiple layer, and based on the weight, we can compute which one is the something that we need to looking for example. So this is the video. If you guys are interested in, I can share the link, and we can visit later. And this is the other example to how we calculate the numerical information into the visual perception. So what I'm trying to say is that the urban is, as I said, it's full of data. So we, and the local government or organization, they actually pile the information to represent their data. At the same time, we are architecture, we are like human beings, a visual animal. So we also have like a visual, the perception of the city, such as like a Google Street View. So we can parse like as an image, then we can numerically define and then calculate how the, what kind of relationship can detect between economic data and social data and the visual perception. So these are sort of the study that possibly we can deploy the machine learning, because my understanding with machine learning is more about like, extracting patterns from a lot of data that people cannot see. So this is a sort of a tool to see how we abstract and compress our urban as a sort of a numeric number. yeah, this is the other example of looking at the urban city. So this is the project that I submit with the Dong-Se Kim, who is the professor at NIIP. So we try to see the relationship between the Instagram and the keyword with the newly open, the renovated space in the Seoul. So these are more about like there are three angles. One angle is how the Seoul government shape this project and then what is their purpose. And the other angle is how people enjoy and then perceive this space from the bottom-up area. And then the last one is the architects. They have their own sort of the purpose to design this area. And then we can try to see how we, their what is the sort of the relationship, and then what is the discord between their purpose and then the actual result from the citizen. Yeah. And these are the other example of the how we visualizing the urban data. This is my master's thesis. So I'm trying to, because at that time, the San Francisco area is one of the top, like the city where a lot of international people gather. So I'm trying to represent the urban city by the data. So what I'm saying is so I'm trying to understand the relationship between the GIS data and the data about the free, because at that time there are several the free space for the homeless people, or not only homeless people, but also the tourists, so we can extract how people possibly gather along these kind of the free stuffs. So these are sort of the examples of the visualization. And also, this is the other example that I developed with the Dr. Jung-Yeon Woo. We are dealing with the urban network system, which is sort of a deterministic data process. So based on this network analysis, we can implement the centrality analysis and accessibility analysis, which is sort of well-known sort of lens for the looking at the urban context. So these are tools how we generate the data from the existing network context, so that we can analyzing how to vitalizing or how to degrade or upgrade the area on the basis of this numeric result from the network analysis. This is also the other way of looking at how we are dealing with the urban data and extracting data, or not only extracting but also like the generating the data. And also we have the urban has interesting because it's not only generating the data by the human being or citizen, but also it has a lot of the data related to the nature, right? So it has something to do with the fluid dynamic analysis system. So while you actually interact with this kind of the playground, we can dynamically simulate the fluid dynamics. So you can think about this one as a like section of the building, or the plan for some urban district. So these are also, we can generate the data, and then we can articulate how we need to shape the urban in terms of this kind of the dynamic flow analysis system. And also when it comes to talk about the urban data, also we can think about like the remote sensing system. It's because nowadays we also use the deep learning, which is about like the imagery extracting the knowledge. So in the image processing, there's a lot of the opportunity as like under the name of the remote sensing, because we can extract the data out of the image, which is the satellite image, things like that. So these are some of the products that I'm working on in ASRI. So I'm mainly developing some of the visualization platform for the novice user. The interesting point what I wanted to talk about is that, the novice, in terms of the mapping, the most important thing is how we labeling the data and insight from the existing data. In that context, the most important thing is how we deploy our sort of the domain knowledge. So individual people, I mean, we are architectural design or urban design, we have our specialists, but some people out there, they have their own sort of the domain, even if they are not like architect or urban designers, but they have their particular eyes or perspective towards the data. So these are sort of the platform for novice user. People can map their information and then they can read and try to create some story on the basis of the the data, which is very interesting because it sometimes give us like a very insightful like a way of reading the data. So these are the product that I'm working with Azure right now. These are some the engineering related works. And then this is my last sort of the page. As I said, I'm interested in the think about like the design process on the basis of data, and also as I mentioned, the data and the urban has full of data. So I'm very into like how we extract and visualizing data to incorporate this insightful result into your design system. So there are some the workshop and the Medium page to discuss a little more detail about my stance toward urban data and design and computation approach. Yeah, these are pretty much about it today. So if you guys have any question, please let me know.
Yeah, that's extraordinary. Thank you so much. We'll take questions, I think, at the end after Dianna's presented. I've just wrapped up my section here, but that was truly extraordinary. Thank you so much. I wonder if it's possible for you to pass on some of those links so we can share them. We actually have been live streamed on YouTube and Bilibili. We'll hopefully be able to pass those on to the chat there. But that was it. That was extraordinary work. It was fantastic to see. I should say that Namjoo Lee was collaborating with Dianna Bogosian last summer on the Digital Futures initiative. And I'd like to move on to Dianna to invite her to share her screen and also make a presentation about the work that she's been doing.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity to share the work, but also engage in a conversation with everybody here, especially with Namjoo, because we've been having these ongoing conversations for a few years. We've attempted at collaborations in a couple of different capacities, so I'm really excited to expand this conversation today. So I would like to pick up the conversation where Neil and NJ left off, and title on my presentation is Urban Environmental Interfaces, Data-Driven Immersive Media for Participatory Urban Environmental Literacy and Policy. So I have an interdisciplinary background in architecture and media arts, but along the way, I dabbled into data science, spatial science, and for my dissertation, mainly using spatial computing to communicate the information. Now, along with that, I want to give you a little bit of my background and how the research or interest on the, let's say, data-driven urban design or data-driven information design has come about. I graduated from Columbia GSAP in 2010, and that was a very interesting year because the conversation around big data was initiated that year. So maybe we heard the term beforehand, but The Economist in 2010 had this really important article about the concept of data deluge. And with that, I would say the conversation around big data was introduced to the public. And 2010 to 2012, let's say plus minus 1 or 2 years, that was a very important era in conversations around data science, but also spatial science. So a lot of universities, such as where I was at the time, Columbia Universities, they established their data science department, but also they began to really invest in spatial science department. This is a really interesting shift in the way that also a lot of information visualization software were developed, introduced. but also the way that also, a lot of online platforms for coding and in conversations around open source information share was introduced. At the time, also a lot of cities began to think about really indexing information and also beginning to think about creating public hubs for information share. So right after graduation, I began to teach at Columbia, and the course that I was teaching called Approaching Convergence focused on the relationship between information visualization and spatial computing. So our students delved into information visualization, whether it was, let's say, Twitter information visualization, the zoning information, and then begin to think about formulating design questions that would then use data-driven workflows to possibly propose policy change. But at the time, also my interest in spatial computing took another turn. I was very much fascinated with people like Sarah Williams at a time. I'll talk about her a little bit more, and begin to think about really available GIS databases, but also remote sensing. So remote sensing is a quite new field, and along with GIS has quite a lot of possibility. Here we're looking at an archive that I've put together, which looks at progression of Los Angeles. So let's say this data is available as shapefile, as a vector-based file. But once you start to actually compile them and animate them, so introduce time, perhaps introduce a story, but start to also combine that with remote sensing, then there's a lot of interesting hidden layers that one can begin to discover and unveil. And one thing that's really fascinating about remote sensing, which is use of satellites to begin to then look at different color bands and extract information, is the fact that it's directly related to obviously advancements in computer vision, but also the way that, let's say, object classification has been developed. So there we went from an overall looking at an overall city to beginning to think about separation of roads, etc. One of the important books, I would argue, along with what Neil has introduced, is this book called Decoding the City by Dietmar Olfenhuber, who's currently at the Northeastern University, and Carlo Ratti, who's at MIT, and NJ also has a relationship working at Sensible City. And this book, which was introduced in 2014, and it kind of archives a series of projects up to this point, and mainly coming from a Sensible City Lab and the collaborators, was quite, I would say, fundamental in the way that a lot of conversations around urban informatics and information visualizations have been shaped. One of the most interesting arguments that this book put forward is the fact that we truly cannot think about urban design and city construction the way that we've had before. So we are never able to plan long term. We're never going to be able to potentially create another Manhattan with the top-down grid. However, the amount of information that we have in hand and possibility to actually extract information allows us to make short-term decisions, but these are going to be more accurate decisions. So I think this is really important. The fact that here we're talking about, let's say, importance of analysis, importance of correlation, but also we're talking about much shorter-term decision-making. And I think this is where also my interest from perhaps thinking about what the future of cities would look like goes away to then think about perhaps what the cities of futures would feel like, or what the cities of futures would facilitate, or how they would, in a sense, in a complementary way, work with what we currently have. So perhaps it's not a complete rethinking, but it's more of a complementary way of thinking about how introduction of time and information could create this, perhaps sometimes material or immaterial layers over what we currently have. While I was teaching this spatial computing and information visualization course, I was very much interested in also introducing process of information collection to the students. So here we were looking at a very simple workflow of how just using accelerometer a gyroscope. All of your devices, in this case, students have phones and sensors in their pockets, could be streamed and stored in a cloud, and then it could create different types of, in this case, shelters. So we were speculating if you have your phones already with you all the time, what would maybe a shelter for an earthquake would feel or look like. So along the way, also interest in visualizing the invisible was something that I was very much interested in looking at. So here we're looking at the main public gathering space of Columbia University and thinking about how tracking Wi-Fi signal could start to maybe allows us to think about creation of public space. So this course was more, in this case, it was more about the workflow of actually gathering Wi-Fi signals versus visualization of the public space. At the same time, sorry, I'm going to go back one more. At the same time, beginning to think about that, just because we had facility to, let's say, extract information, and we were told that we're in this process of, we're in this era of data deluge, it didn't mean that we had the right type of information. So for instance, here we're looking at wind information visualization. Wind traditionally has been one of the most difficult information to accurately visualize because of the resolution and three-dimensionality. So here were students, you cannot hear this because it's quite actually, it's quite noisy, but we were extracting these decibels from audio that wind would create, and then visualizing this in a real-time manner. I want to also introduce this book by Sarah Williams, somebody that I mentioned earlier. So she was quite important in inspiring me when I was a student at Columbia. She's currently at MIT, and the series of data collection work that she was doing focused on air quality, but also looking at existing GIS data and coming up with novel way of visualizing this. So I highly recommend this book. She really talks about how information from gathering to visualization can lead to policy change, which is a very big passion of mine. At the same time, I opened this talk by talking about data deluge, just because there's this kind of call that we have information. It doesn't mean that we have the right type of information. But what can you do with the information at hand? So here with students, we were looking at, I'm going to go back and sorry, play this one more time. This was, we were beginning to think about Seoul Biennial, and we were invited to do a series of information visualizations, and we were looking at weather station data that we can get from different districts and think about ways that we can take not so high resolution information, in this case, one value per district, and visualize it using string system. And then introducing students to remote sensing and satellite information visualization, and begin to, again, look at city of Seoul and try to extract from satellite imagery information about heat island effect. So along the way, while the interest in information visualization was always there, but this realization that actually we're still, just because we have information, it doesn't mean that we have the right type of information. So what do? Do we just sit back and wait for governments to collect this data, or can the process of information collection, information acquisition become actually how the citizen could be involved along the process? So a really important figure in this field is Eric Paulos, who's currently at Berkeley. And over the years, he's created really incredible projects that are looking at how citizen science approaches could be facilitated for looking at different types of urban data collection, but also solutions. So along with that, the rest of these examples that I'm going to show will focus on more environmental data visualization. So currently, the way that environmental data visualization is done is either done using simulation. So a lot of our students, let's say at FIU or everywhere else, they're using plugins such as, let's say, Ladybug, Honeybee, Diva, Butterfly, etc. And these simulation platforms are often relying on information that's gathered from weather station. And although, this information could be temporally high resolution, so you can gather them every few seconds, but often this information it has low spatial resolution. So for instance, here we were looking at information in New York, and let's say all around New York State, these are the weather stations that we could draw from, in this case, based on limitation of the database. So in order to kind of fill the spatial resolution, one needs to kind of become creative. So here we were looking at a workflow for taking more two-dimensional wind simulation and turning it into 3D by introducing, let's say, layer, more planar information that then could be spatialized. Or here our students were looking at a pavilion design in Central Park, and again, lack of availability, spatial resolution of information. It created some variation, but the variation were quite, were within a certain matrix of possibility. So the reason for this is that usually these weather stations are placed in urban areas called idealized locations. So they're quite removed because these devices are quite expensive. So although you are able to get a pretty high caliber information, but again, the lack of spatial resolution could be problematic. So alternative to this would be if you actually begin mapping yourself. So here I was teaching a course in American University of Armenia where they're interested in mapping pollution, and we realized that how much the type of trees that were planted were important. We weren't able to find GIS data. So a group of our students begin the task of tree information or tree position collection. We weren't able to, in a sense, we had to devise a tool for information collection. So we wrote this very simple application, which took the GPS information of their phones and then stored the information with type of trees. So this was quite important because we were at the end able to actually provide the university with a new database, but it took them quite a long time, almost a week, to document all this, the trees of the city center. So in this case, the alternative to simulation is fieldwork. However, fieldwork could be quite time consuming. So here we're looking at another example. I was teaching a workshop at SciArc 2 years ago. And we had a site, and students were given a series of sensors, and they went to a site and began to locate where the trees were located, and then information about height and canopy of the trees, right? So it was an interesting mapping exercise because then they were able to learn more about tools of collection. However, as you can imagine, this was quite time consuming to be able to actually go through this process of collection and then cleaning up the data and then mapping. So in a sense, the way that we can think about environmental sensing methods, and again, this is a classification that's something that me and my colleague Maide Yaguna have put together. We can break it down into 4 categories, and the differences between local versus remote, and between static versus dynamic or mobile. These categorizations are based on the relationship of the sensor and the object that's being sensed. And each of them have pros and cons. So for instance, if we're looking at the weather station model that I showed earlier, so this could be quite costly, but it has low spatial resolution and it has high temporal resolution. At the same time, if we're looking at, let's say, the example of our students walking around the city and collecting information of the trees, that's an example of local mobile sensing, which in this case, we're using affordable, let's say, sensors. And this could have high spatial resolution, but because everybody could be in one position at a time, this would have low temporal resolution. So the question here is if there's ways that we can begin to combine these methods and over time begin to increase resolution of, in this case, let's say an environmental parameter. It could be air quality, it could be water quality sampling, whatever that might be. So these are more methods of sensing. So for most of the work that I've been doing has focused on local mobile sensing and beginning to think about how this workflow could be expanded. And local mobile sensing is not a new, let's say, method. So London, as the first industrial city, was the first city where this was tested. So Tony Chandler looked at attaching sensors to cars and then begin to map, do mapping in City of London, and then also overlaying of microclimatic data over urban data has been something that's been done over time. And it allows one to then begin to think about urban patterns and as well as microclimatic patterns. So most of my research has focused on air quality. However, since moving to Miami, I've been able to adopt these methods and apply that to water quality sensing and visualization. So the purpose here is to begin to think about what would allow ultimate participation from the citizens, from, let's say, interested parties, and at the same time, how information visualization using interactive media could facilitate the process. So this work has been done, similar work has been done in cities like Zurich, where over time they were looking at increase of, in this case, information that was collected from sensors that were attached to trams. At the same time, another project from Sensible City, they've looked at attaching sensors to bicycles to then increase resolution. One thing that's interesting about environmental data visualization is that it's highly relying on GPS and but also very traditional methods of communication, such as mapping and using color gradients. However, they do lack interactivity. They also lack, let's say, creative ways of engaging the citizens. What's really important is that when it comes to environmental literacy, there's been some really important moments. So for instance, this is a visualization called the Keeling curve, which was a graph that was presented in 1958. This Keeling curve has been in the forefront of all the environmental movements since late 1950s, and it's been used for policy, for grants, and for scientific research. So this one graph has been, I would say, responsible for all the CO2 increase conversation that has happened since. So the question here is, how can, let's say, more immersive way of information communication further help to environmental literacy and policy change? And one thing that's really important about, let's say, immersive modes of information visualization is the fact that it allows you to discover new patterns. So John Tukey, who was a statistician, has coined this thing called exploratory data analysis, or EDA, which it encourages you to, before you look at data, not make a hypothesis. So often in a scientific method, you would begin with a hypothesis, and then you would begin to look at your data to identify patterns. What's really important about this EDA method is the fact that it really encourages more of an open-ended approach to looking at information. We know that also with the advent of locative media, truly our cities could be revolutionized. So what Shumi envisioned as the event city, because of the way that the policy of the park maintenance was set up, it really never visualized his mission. But actually what really happened at the park with Pokemon Go is really fascinating. So I really like to look at this example as a true way that immersive media, locative media could be engaged with this. I'm gonna go quite fast and talk about 2 quick projects. I should be able to wrap up in 2-3 minutes. Neil, is that okay?
Yeah, take your time. Take your time.
Thank you.
This is great. Thank you.
So, so we've been doing series of data collection exercises, and actually Digital Futures has been part of some of this investigation. So here we were looking at a low-grade sensor assembly that could be attached to bicycles, but also drones. So the way that this is set up, if you flip it over, you can actually attach it to drones, but you can also, let's say, add your camera phone, Here we also have a thermal camera, and you can attach it to your bicycle. It could also be a wearable option. You'll see it along the way. And the interest is to begin to think about ways that we can engage the citizens. So this was the very, very first version on campus of USC and getting our real-time visualization working. And then since we've used this, this, let's say, assembly with different type of visualization. So here we're looking at using real-time visualization using GIS data and looking at only one variable, but two people biking at the same time. So we could see that actually temperature doesn't change that much. Some of it could be due to topography, and then beginning to think about, well, if this doesn't communicate much, what are other ways that we can do that? So let's say traditionally scientists use MATLAB, but can we start to maybe skew the data in MATLAB to begin to maybe make it a little bit more drastic? But what if we begin to think about what we can get from the camera? So here we're looking at taking the information, looking at just only two variables, so temperature change that could map to your image temperature color. So red is higher temperature and blue is lower temperature, and also mapping CO2 to pixelation. So here we came off the campus, we're going more towards the freeway. You can see that the pixelation is increasing, CO2 is increasing. So it's a very quick way to begin to communicate two parameters that are sometimes linear and sometimes inverse. However, we begin to understand complexity of these two parameters, right? So that it's not always one-to-one. So when we quickly look at this information, we can see in the upper left corner, we were on campus in a more green area, so lower temperature, lower CO2 levels. However, as we went outside the campus, this became more drastic, right? So sometimes it's more red with smaller pixels, sometimes it's more blue with larger pixels. Then beginning to think about the vertical reading, so use of drones and photogrammetry has been an ongoing part of this. So here we were looking at vertical scanning of the buildings using the same two parameters. So temperature for color temperature change and CO2 level for pixelation size. But then what if we introduce a graph? What's great about drones, you could actually time how much they could increase per level. And it actually helps with looking at the ED effect. And then also, if it goes up, it needs to come down. So you quickly have two readings. And this visualization, I would say, out of all the work that I've done, has been one of the ones that people most respond to, because once it lifts up, there's this sense of relief, things clear up, and then it goes down again. There's this sense of heaviness. You understand that actually CO2 and heat, they actually tend to also be trapped. So we went through many iterations of mapping, and at the end, after a lot of parameterizations, we were able to plot this over campus, and we realized that actually there's this one really polluted corner, which is this this third corner. And after many studies, we realized that actually what was this attributed to was the length of the traffic light. And we realized that actually this is something that we can start to think about how if we had an air quality sensor which was correlated to traffic light, it could begin a conversation with the city. So we were able to talk to campus, then start a conversation with the city. So this could be an example of how, without this visualization, you weren't able to perhaps have this finding, and how this information visualization can potentially trigger a policy change. After that, a little bit more about Seoul. We were granted an innovation grant, and from Princeton, and along with my colleague Maida Yaguno, we did series of assessing for Seoul Biennial in 2017, and we were able to upgrade our sensing kit, have hypo magnets, introduce solar panels, and begin to work with the city to have a number of sensor kits that were attached to the buses, and they were able to roam around and collect information for duration of the biennial. And then in the exhibition space, participants were able to look at the information. There was a lot of learning that happened here. So for instance, I was recently talking to my colleague, and we were discussing how much dust this box is collected and how that could potentially be an example of information physicalization. But also we realized that the way that we were anticipating programming of the solar power was much different, because we didn't actually know how the city would operate, rain, and so just a lot of unpredicted things happened. With that, we created 2 AR apps. So one of them used the same method that we use on USC campus to use color gradient and connect to the nearest weather stations and the sensors that were roaming. But I would say the most interesting part was this app, which allowed us to work with the city and collect about 30 years of air quality data and compile it into an AR app, which allowed people to walk on this 2 meter by 2 meter map, look at 30 years of air quality data over the 25 districts, and at the same time try to also have a real-time visualization component that we could connect to all the weather stations in real time, and then every 2 seconds information was being updated. It was really exciting because we had a lot of officials that visited this. We were able to, let's say, highlight general trends, turn on topo, and people were excited to find where they lived and find what the pollution was. But what we realized after looking at the data after the biennial was the fact that we just didn't have enough data with the number of buses that were, we had the permission to use. Then we allocated versions of this, and this was mainly done by my colleague Maider. I was in New York at the time, and we began to think about how this could be taken further. I'm going to end with this few minutes of this. The ongoing project is working with an IoT testbed on USC campus, and this was before the pandemic. We had a series of sensor boxes. This is one of the early tests. Where so we had this IoT hubs, and in this case, the sensor using AR, then people could find these and then begin to think about what the sensors are. At the same time, they could use their USC ID card to pull up a map of the campus, find where these test beds are, and at the same time, click on any of the test beds and look at the data pattern that was collected from them. So this is an ongoing project that's been stopped because I'm not able to be on campus and work there, but hoping to be able to do a version of this and make this a little bit more interactive and hold an event where I could actually start to understand patterns and interaction with this. Thank you. Sorry that it took too much time.
I mean, don't apologize. That was amazing. Thank you so much, Namjoo. Thank you, Dianna. That was an astonishing insight into some of the things that are beginning to happen. What I find really interesting is I think your timeline in terms of kind of, I think it was 2010, the kind of the big data thing. It's amazing how things have changed in the last few years, and this is fantastic to see such kind of cutting edge work. Really remarkable. So thanks so much, Namjoo and Dianna. I want to. I mean, I almost feel like I'm compared to that. I'm what I have to say is much too kind of abstract and theoretical. But I just want to kind of comment on a few things. One is to say that with this, I think this work has to be put alongside the kind of the. I haven't got here an image of the environmental sensing systems, but when you also use that in her work on an XCall to the point that, and also I think what's happening is now is all these informational systems like GIS potentially being eclipsed by ever new developments as the kind of the pace of change begins to hot up. And also just to mention that a few weeks ago, along with YU, Theodoros Galanis was presenting his extraordinary work, where these tools are really having a huge impact on how we begin to sort of visualize, taking into account all sorts of things like wind comfort and solar radiation and things. And then just also to mention the fact that there's other research that's going on. Patrick referred to this, to the way in which you can use, create these kind of digital twins to model the kind of potential layout of interiors using these agents that as Patrick puts it, are kind of navigating this information-rich environment and using it to kind of like to model possible layouts. And you can do this with a digital twin, whereas you can't do that with so easily within a physical space. So in many ways, there's a kind of revolution happening, this information revolution, which is really taking hold and having an impact way beyond what we could have imagined 10 years ago, way beyond even what I think Ben Bratton might have imagined in 2009. So I want to just finish with a small kind of afterword in some ways, even though the title of the whole thing was Brain Cities. I wanted to kind of like just reflect in some ways in much more kind of theoretical way. And this is just the beginning of some research. So the first time I really have addressed this kind of question was in the chapter of my forthcoming book, and I think this is just beginning to maybe open up possibilities that can be taken much further. But the idea that maybe we can begin to sort of somehow see the city in terms of some kind of brain. I mean, just to kind of repeat what I said earlier on, I think the book by Stephen Johnson, where in the subtitle, The Connected Lives of Ants, Brains, Cities and Software, that itself presupposes in some sense that we can begin to kind of put together the idea of the city and the idea of a brain and the idea of software. I want to just in some ways take that a little bit further. I think that Stephen Johnson's mapping that somehow the city looks like a brain, I'm not so convinced about that, especially I think visualization is one particular kind of question, but information is really, to my mind, the kind of key question. How do you visualize information itself? And so simple modeling of what a brain might look like, or indeed how you might begin to sort of map and track the brain, is not so interesting as, to my mind, as informative as what the kind of question itself of information. So I wanted to kind of like to open up with the question that John Holland has sort of raised, the way in which a city somehow manages to kind of maintain a certain sort of equilibrium. That it's a mystery, for him. It's a mystery how the city itself can somehow, despite the multiple changes that you get, nonetheless it maintains a some form of homeostasis, like the standing wave in front of a rock in a fast-moving stream. The city is a pattern of time, even though the molecules of the water are constantly changing. Nonetheless, there is something that emerges as a kind of like a pattern that remains constant. I always think of this analogy in terms of the AA, where there's a constant throughput of faculty who come in to teach instructors, and yet somehow over the years it somehow maintains a certain overall stability. And I wanted to take this notion that John Holland opens up about how the city maintains that equilibrium. I mean, first of all, I would say that, of course, we need to think about the city not just in terms of buildings, but also agents of human beings themselves that are interacting with buildings themselves. So, but then put it alongside some of the kind of work that's going on with the work of Antonio Damasio, who's also at USC, a neuroscientist originally from Portugal, who's become one of the central sort of figures. And this is his recent book, The Strange Order of Things, where the central idea is this notion of what he calls homeostasis. And homeostasis is kind of, I suppose, the way in which the body maintains this equilibrium. And his view of the brain is really less of the brain as some kind of command control center, not less of a kind of top-down notion, and more of a kind of balancing device, a balancing device that operates through a kind of negative feedback in order to maintain a certain degree of evenness, shall we say. So if the body gets too excited, the brain kind of calms it down. If the body gets too lethargic, the brain will kind of stimulate it in some ways. This is fundamental to survival for Damasio. So there is this kind of model that he's presenting, and I wanted to pick up on the notion of the homeostat itself, which was something which in cybernetic theory has been a kind of a concept that has been pursued. This is an early version of a kind of attempt to model it by William Ashby back in the 50s. And one could say perhaps that this was maybe a kind of, this was a kind of a rather simplistic model, but nonetheless, it was kind of interesting in itself as an idea that we could maybe achieve a kind of homeostatic condition. What I find also interesting about this particular story is that Alan Turing noticed this observation, and he wrote to Ashby. Sir Charles Darwin, actually, this is the grandson of Charles Darwin, and he mentioned the fact that he'd seen this, and he basically offers that his the use of his early protocomputer as a way of modeling this. But what I find interesting in some ways is this idea. He says here, in working on the ACE, I am more interested in the possibility of producing models of the notion of the brain than in the practical applications of computing. I mean, Turing was an astonishing person, but this is kind of laying out that he's actually interested in also in the world of neuroscience and how we might use computation to kind of address things. So this was the bomb, the early kind of proto-computer that he produced, and so on. I mean, so the question would be whether, in fact, we could think about the city, or think about comparisons between maybe even AI in the city, about how the city could be seen as a kind of brain and so on. First of all, let me just make it absolutely clear that Damasio would never entertain this notion. Damasio, for Damasio, the notion of feelings, the notion of kind of feedback from the body itself is absolutely central. And there's no way that he would equate somehow the kind of the abstract, dry, mechanical behavior of the computer to the wet computer of the brain itself. Even though I'd say, Damasio himself, as somebody who had a background in AI, he was a student of Claude Shannon in his early days and was very excited by all these kind of the initial research into AI. But over time, he began to realize, well, interesting as it was, the body itself was much a different sort of different entity. But maybe rather than necessarily thinking about literal comparisons between the brain and the city, which I think would be kind of reductivist in the extreme, we could at least think about the possibility of the city being kind of a kind of brain, not the brain, but some kind of processing operation. And I just want to kind of pick up the question that I came across in my research, and that is to say, whether we could see the brain as a form of computer. And what I find interesting is the overlap that you get right now between neuroscientists and AI experts, in the sense that Demis Hassabis, who was the one who created AlphaGo, the CEO of DeepMind, Demis Hassabis did took a PhD in neuroscience before becoming an expert in AI. And conversely, we have figures like Anil Seth, who did a PhD in AI before going to work on neuroscience. And it seems to me there is a kind of an overlap there in terms of the research, which makes it incredibly interesting as a field. It's almost like they are addressing the same kind of question. My conclusion in my book was the notion that the quest for AI was the quest for intelligence itself. They were not interested so much in artificial intelligence, but really what was intelligence. And but what was interesting here is that Demis Hassabis is claiming that the brain is like a computer. I guess again you could increase if your notion of the computer was broad enough, you could maybe think that could maybe a question to address. But there is another view, and that is to say that the brain is not like a computer at all. It's more like the internet. And this is the thesis that Jeffrey Steibel advances in his book Wired for Thought. And there's, I guess, again, there's pointless kind of looking at literal kind of comparisons between the way that the internet operates and the way that the brain operates. But more, we could think more abstractly about this. And this is the kind of the reasoning that he gives. And Jeffrey Steibel is somebody who also has a kind of a PhD in neuroscience and has been working in the area also of technological development, and therefore is somebody who's right in the heart of things. And he kind of makes these comparisons. I mean, again, they're just simply kind of speculative, but nonetheless they're intriguing to how we can begin to sort of see the internet as being based on a kind of a logic that gets very close to the notion of how the brain operates. So without going into further sort of detail, there is a thesis, we can say, that the brain is not so much like a computer, although they have discovered mini computers in the brain, or what they describe as being mini computers. It's more like the internet itself. And curiously, neuroscientists also have kind of backed up this idea and have been at least drawing comparisons between the way in which the internet operates and the way in which the brain operates. So the debate is out there. The question, therefore, is being raised as to whether we can somehow see the city as some kind of internet brain. And here I want to kind of like refer to a relatively new development in China, City Brain, which has been developed by Alibaba, which has been exploring the possibility of how we might use AI as a kind of like a digital twin that might be used to try and to control and model the behavior of the city through a kind of real-time monitoring of the behavior of the city. One can then use a kind of computational model to adjust and improve certain questions. And to my mind,
Sorry, are you sharing your screen? Because we cannot see your screen.
Oh, really?
Yeah, if you could reshare it.
Were you not seeing anything at all?
We stopped seeing maybe for the past few minutes.
Oh, I wonder what happened there. Did we see? Oh, I see. Okay. Can I just go back and just check and see what?
Yeah, we didn't see after the Monsieur.
Oh, so we saw. Okay.
Yeah, we saw there.
Did we see the homeostat?
Yes.
And then Alan Turing?
No.
Okay, let me just for the sake of my apologies, I'm not quite sure what happened there. But this is the kind of comment where okay. My apologies, I know what happened. So just to say, this is the letter that Turing writes to Ashby, volunteering the use of his ACE and commenting that he's more interested in the use of of understanding the brain than actually the practical uses of computing. Of course, he was an incredible polymath. So this, okay, well, it's good that I'm at least showing this again so you can see what I was referring to. So Demis Hassabis, this is a quote from Demis Hassabis where he's comparing the brain to a computer. And then Jeffrey Steibel, this is the quote from him where he says, well, it's not the computer we could compare to the brain, it's the internet, and it operates in a fundamentally different way. These are visualizations of the internet and the brain, which I don't think are so important so much as the comments that he makes about how you can draw these comparisons. And they are just that. This kind of speculative. It's not proven as such, but he's still making this comparison about the city and the brain, which itself I think is extraordinarily interesting. But then the point that this is the quote that I thought I was showing you. My apologies, by these two neuroscientists from San Diego, who actually are commenting that actually maybe that's not so far-fetched, because there are certain mechanisms that are kind of shared between the brain and the internet that suggest that maybe that's not that it makes more kind of sense. So okay, so here we are with City Brain. There's not much I can show by way of visualization of City Brain, because it's really everything's happening on the computer. But the idea that it's this kind of digital twin that allows you to monitor the world of traffic, the world of the city itself. And this is simply a comment by Liu Feng that he's talking about. The notion of City Brain, which is the Alibaba initiative, which has been used to really try and monitor the city and trying to use some of these computational devices to maintain, in some senses, the kind of homeostatic thing by addressing, in particular, but not exclusively, the question of traffic itself. So this is what you see. It's not going to tell you straightforwardly that much about what's happening, but nonetheless, it is interesting that this has been so successful. It seems in the number of things that they point towards. One is the fact that they can detect accidents in advance before anyone's kind of like called for the police or the ambulance. They can detect that in advance, and also it has a huge impact in getting emergency vehicles to an accident on time, and of course relieving the traffic congestion. By controlling the traffic, you can avoid traffic jams. And this model has been initially was used in Alibaba's home city, where it was based. A city with particular traffic problems has been used elsewhere in China, now also in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, and I'm sure in many cities to come. It seems to me the model of where we're going to be going in the future. And this is the kind of the comment that he makes, that cities will learn to think. Well, at one level, of course, cities don't think, or at least AI doesn't think. I mean, I think that, well, the term thinking is problematic. You've got to have consciousness to be able to think, and therefore I would avoid that. I know that the term has been used even by computer scientists. Toby Walsh has a book called Machines That Think. They don't think as such, but nonetheless, one can maybe conceive of the city in terms of an amalgam of buildings and people in which there is a degree of consciousness. Therefore, we could possibly kind of use this kind of term. But I think the point is not so much whether the preciseness of the language, but more the concept, the idea that we have this this new possibility of monitoring in real time, and therefore being able to kind of through or augment, as it were, the city itself, and of course connected with the idea of the self-driving car. Everything could be integrated into one particular kind of system, and so the conclusion that I come to in a way is here's Elon Musk, the director of Tesla, talking about how we've become cyborgs and how we've become superhuman because of these prosthetic devices that can become an extension of the self. What I would suggest, a way of conceptualizing this notion of the city brain, is a way in which the city, which in some ways is already to some extent intelligent, that is the thesis behind emergence, the idea there is intelligence in the city, but the city already intelligent, but it can have let's say an augmented form of intelligence. The two terms used for AI as a prosthesis are extended intelligence and then also intelligence augmentation. So the idea that maybe if like the body itself can have, let's say, a pacemaker, so the heart can have a pacemaker to control its rhythm and so on. My perception is that we'll very soon be seeing this as a kind of AI as a kind of form of augmentation, so that the city brain itself could be seen as kind of like a way in which the intelligence that already exists in a city could itself be enhanced by the use of AI. So I'm going to stop sharing now and open up towards questions. I mean, it seems to me that this is a huge field. It's a huge field that is expanding on a daily basis, and it's transforming the discipline of architecture and I guess urban studies in the whole as a whole. Yes. Let me open up to particular kind of to anyone who has any particular questions. Yeah. So, and my apologies for not sharing my screen. I don't know what happened there. And I guess, I mean, the idea is I guess that it's not so much AI but intelligence, and the idea that we can use these systems expansively to not only monitor but also when it comes to designing design with a way in which we can somehow see less the kind of notion of form for the sake of form. In some senses, the initial idea behind parametricism, and more form as informed, so by informational systems, and especially by informational systems that themselves are tracking performance. So I always think that notion of how we can see form in both the words form, or all the words form, information, and performance, speaks about a kind of new paradigm by which we can increasingly be more kind of aware of environmental systems and so on. So I'd like to invite some questions. We have Theodoros here who's also kind of working in a similar kind of way. I don't know if Theodoros would be interested in opening up the discussion. Yeah.
Maybe I could start. I think obviously from Stephen Johnson's book all the way to the use of, I believe at the Angewandte in 2010s also there was a Brain City initiative to look at urban design by kind of comparing it to the human brain. And I'm personally not sure how productive the one-to-one comparison is, but more about beginning to think about basically network theory and how the way that, let's say, a neuron connectivity could be then compared to, let's say, other metaphors that are currently, used in also artificial intelligence research, as well as the way that that could kind of translate to more of a traditional way of thinking about architecture and urban design. So I could definitely see the desire to use metaphors and use comparison, but I personally I'm not sure if it's so productive to then create a linear connection between the human brain and the city as maybe a polycentric organization, other than just understand that perhaps we're talking about network theory. You're muted.
I think, yeah, I meant to mention that actually, the early work that was done actually was by Wolf Prix, and he was, of course, Wolf is. I always find interesting for somebody who's kind of claimed not to be theoretical. Everything he says is kind of like somehow informed by some of these kind of these ideas, and he is a big. He's very close to a leading Austrian neuroscientist, Wolf Singer. I'm sure that Sandra and Matthias know him, and there was this initial theme of the kind of, which was again extremely metaphorical, the kind of the studies that were done using multi-agent systems some time back. And I mean, it's worth saying, of course, that the whole notion of swarm intelligence. I mean, what level of intelligence are we seeing here? And I think that's the kind of key question. So I guess, yeah, maybe I'm kind of taking a more kind of abstract theoretical sort of view of things, and I think it's more the precise mechanisms that we need to think about in terms of what you and Namjoo are doing. But it seems to me it's opening up a whole way in which we can understand the city as being informed and operating much more efficiently using these devices. Maybe I can ask. Marina has a question. Maybe I can invite Marina to ask.
Yes, hello. Good morning. Thank you for your presentation. It's amazing the work that the two of you are doing. It's great in several ways. And I'm thinking about a little bit about the topic of the class in terms of what you're doing and what can be in a way like certain or possible, because we have like this. I have a question that is going to different lines. One is more complex, the other is more a direct question. The first one is like in this. It seems that in this idea of the brain, it's like in a way like something related with cognitive neuroscience, but also with philosophy in terms of this mind-body problem, no? If it's the brain or if it's the mind, no? And we have like, because there is like a lot, it's a huge discussion in terms of, for example, materialists believe that the mental phenomena are identical to the neuronal phenomena, no? So in this way, it's like this like relation. So one question that I have is like, okay, if it's the internet, not the computer, because the idea of the mind, more like the brain exactly, is like in terms of, for example, what you are using data visualization, which is like something like you don't have like matter exactly, and then how you translate in or how you process this data in order to interact with the material world. So I was thinking like, in a way, just that's the more complex aspect that I believe that it's not necessary to go deeper on this. But one of the questions that I have is like, it was discussed like a long time, like, I don't know, like, 10 years ago at least, or even more, in architecture, the datascape, You know, that they use, like, for example, you have like offices like MVRDB or some offices which translate in a way the data to the architectural designs. So one of my questions is like, what do you think that could be the misuses of this data in terms of architectural design? Like in a way, like if you can see like that it can be a problem in terms of translation directly to the like form generative device. And so that will be my question. What do you think that it could be like the problems of the data visualization in the use for architectural design specifically?
I think the problem of information visualization is more of a problem of information in general. So for instance, when we're talking about artificial intelligence, when we're talking about data, ultimately we're talking about a form of statistics, right? Or statistical models, or let's say version of that. One thing that's really important to note is that is the fact that not only we have this overwhelming amount of data, which then, you know, I claim that actually sometimes is not the right type of data, but there's, I think everybody here is well aware of all the conversations about data and bias. And actually, it's interesting to note that the most popular or the most highest sold book in statistics is called How to Lie with Statistics by Daryl Huff. And this is the most popular book in statistics because it's kind of one of the I'll paste it in chat. It's one of those books that it's actually introduced as a must-read for statisticians and data scientists. And this is kind of reality of information, right? So because this is an inherent problem in the way that data is generated, the way that it's interpreted, and the way that then data is also translated, or in this case, governed, then that's inherently part of also information visualization, not to mention all the subjectivity that one brings in the process of even communication, right? So in a sense, this is something that is embedded in every step of the process. And so I think it's quite interesting to then understand the importance of that, especially with all the ongoing conversation that's also happening about AI and bias, along with information surveillance and bias, right? So here we're talking about many, many layers of complexity. And I think one way forward is to just be able to understand the imperfection of each step and be able to understand that often that comes from the way that the initial database is set up. And then that's something that just, it has this snowball effect and continues over and over again. Actually, Sarah Williams in that book, Data Action, one of the early visualizations that they did with Laura Kruger from, again, GSAP, they were looking at a relationship of the demographic information and a number of prisoners in different New York boroughs. And this was a research that was done in mid-2000s to late 2000s. And with the latest Black Lives Matter protests and also all the prison reform conversation that has taken place, she was mentioning that how those graphs and those visualization from late 2000s were used over and over again to argue one side or the other. So it was very interesting that she was talking about, and they say on one hand she was very distraught because she wanted to say, hey, like this is not, this is not recent, there needs to be more work done on this. But at the same time, she was saying that she was pleased because then she was seeing the importance of information visualization and actually starting conversations. And there's it's all the studies about how we automatically respond so many percentage better. I believe it's 30 times more when we're looking at something that's presented as graph. However, there's also some studies that are looking at how the novelty is wearing off, because currently we are so much saturated with a certain type of information visualization. So definitely the immersive media is one step forward. So I don't know if I answered your question, but it's kind of it's a very tricky double-edged sword, right? Because on one hand, you do want to bring focus and have people pay attention, but at the same time, the whole process is so volatile and ever-changing that's very difficult to look at these as kind of like a standalone scientific evidence. So the killing curve, an example of that, right? It's been used in the CO2 visualization for and against many different ways.
Yeah, also I have one possible perspective to see your question, I guess. So I guess, you know, in terms of the thinking, post-industrial revolution, I guess there's a lot of keyword to represent what's happening behind the scene, like a drone or autonomous vehicle, edge computing. There's a lot of like business or keywords to represent post-industrial revolution. But I think one step back to see the individual keyword. So I guess the most important primary resource is about data. So it's all about like how to collect the data, how to understand the data, how to extract the insight from the data, how to apply this insight to the individual, like, you know, industries such as like autonomous vehicle or Amazon, you know, they are actually, you know, using the ranking system to suggest to the product that people possibly buy. I mean, what I'm trying to say is the fourth industrial revolution is more about like the data revolution, I guess. So the reason I'm saying is because, you know, there are many different types of way to you know, mimic the artificial intelligence. But I guess the most the dominant way of doing this is to use the machine learning. So I mean, there's a lot of way. I mean, research-wise or production-wise, there's a lot of way. But I guess the machine learning is one of the pervasive way to you know, deploy the AI things for our daily life. So what the machine learning does is basically, you know, extract the pattern from the number, because the computer is really good at computing the number, right? But human being, as opposed to computer, human being is really good at, you know, sees some pattern as like a human beings as a visual animal, so we can easy to, you know, extract some pattern from the visual cues. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that the data has a pattern, and then AI dealing with the data as a number, extracted some pattern. And also people can see the data as the visual cue, as a data visualization. So we need to visualizing data as a visual cues in order to see some pattern, you know, because we are good at pattern. So what I'm trying to say is to make some relationship between how people, you know, extract insight from the data and how machine does. So I think the visualization is more about like filtering the data to see what the data said and what kind of the insight that we can extract. So the visualization is a different way of doing, you know, process and categorize the random data into several insights, so that we can, you know, extract some possible knowledge out of data. So but you know, in terms of the design process, I think this is a little bit different story, I guess, because this is sort of a tool and process. Whether you know, take advantage of the tool or not, it fully depends on the your design process or your purpose, I guess. Just like you know, some software 3D tool or 2D tool. So whether you take advantage of the tool or not, it fully depends on. So I guess in terms of the decision-making process, we have one more sort of range or perspective to represent and understand the situation that possibly affect your design decision. So I think this is the one perspective to see how to take advantage or how to utilize technology for the design process, I guess.
Yeah, that's great, because there is like a huge problem in a way because for example, we can see this representation of this visualization, because it's not a representation, but this visualization of data, like something that is already represented, and then we like automatically translate this to an architectural shape, and that could be really a problem in terms of how we deal with it, like how we interact with it, how this in a way influence our decision making. But the second question that I have, like, is more directly, do you think that exists in a way like a kind of data pollution? Because you were talking about sustainability in terms of how you are analyzing all this data in terms of environment, in the case of Dianna more extensively. But do you think that there is like this, now we are dealing with this kind of new pollution in terms of data pollution?
Yeah, I think that's why that cover of Economist from 2010 is really important, the data deluge, because it's literally an image of a guy that's being rained on with data, and in a sense that even the term big data is quite ridiculous, right? So the term is basically any data that is not possible to be processed with existing data management software. In this case was specifically Excel. I forgot exactly how many thousands of cells you could use in Excel, is a couple of 100,000, and then after that it just is not possible. So big data was introduced as a way of saying this big data is too big for us to even to process, and then they use this term data deluge to talk about the overwhelming aspect of that. And we've heard how data is being exponentially growing. But I think the conversation that you're introducing is quite important, because often, especially in architecture, we either say, well, we start with our presentation, so-and-so said, quote, right? And this is very to say, if I can find a reference, then I can validate what I'm doing. It's the same thing with you say that it also goes into sciences based on number of references, or if you could find somebody that validate what you're doing. So if you find the right data, in this case, when you're using data as information, then again, it goes back to the book that I was saying, How to Lie with Statistics. But how are you interpreting that information for or against, right? Because you could argue both ways. And one thing that's interesting is that in a lot of political parties, actually traditionally, at least in the United States, Republicans have been really good at using data for their arguments versus Democrats. So the Republicans have had the most number of bills passed based on actually that were supported by data. So they were able to find the right data. They were able to understand how that could convince certain type of targeted audience, and then pass the right policies based on that. So Democrats have been really lousy at using data for their advantage. And so we understand that there's important when you're making an argument. Now, the environmental conversation is really interesting. The killing curve that I showed, there's actually an incredible book about the killing curve itself, and how a lot of let's say the gathering in Sweden in 1960s from the Kyoto, etc. So everything that has happened since has been actually driven by that, just using that visualization as an argument. And then how other the anti-climate activists or anti-climate let's say policymakers have used that against. But at the same time, recent conversations about NFTs and cryptocurrency, and also the environmental factor, I think that's also really sobering, right? So I think everybody has seen the Memo Actins and other people that are writing about this. So I think this is also a very interesting conversation, right? So I mean, the truth is that a lot of the let's say that work that goes towards environmental literacy, these you need to use a lot of entertainment you need to use a lot of quick, participatory method to gather people's attention just to be able to communicate something. So you can kind of argue that there's a lot of perhaps subjectivity that needs to be introduced to something like this. Yeah, I think this is a very good conversation that's currently happening, and I'm really happy to see that how actually conversations around NFTs and crypto art are going towards this to this environmental route, because I mean, I think one of the people that has been talking about this has been Liam Young with his books and publications to actually talk about this silos and this data farms, and he's actually very beautifully documented them and used it as his work to really understand let's say the heat generated by them, the space that they take up. So I think there needs to be more work done on that front, and I think this latest publications or conversations have been really, really exciting. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Fernanda. That's amazing. Thank you.
There are a few questions that, from the chat. I know that I don't know whether Gustavo, you would like to ask one, or G, but feel free.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Well, thank you, Dianna, and thank you, Namjoo, for your great presentations. Very inspirational. My question is very specifically, maybe also addressing Camille, is the idea of kind of metaphor. It seems as though that you both are using architecture as kind of as a scientific instrument. Like we're basically finding our tools and our skill sets and evolving them to the sciences. So when I hear the metaphor of the brain, it doesn't fit, but what are we seeing? So for me, the stack is one model, but the stack is also incomplete. So what is this total model that we as architects are intuitively moving toward? Because I think it is probably mixed with a mix between humanities and the sciences, but there's metaphor, there's narrative, and then there's the idea of our own imaginary, poetic understanding of space. I think Dianna and Namjoo, how do you intuit this line of research moving forward? Like, what is the ultimate goal, maybe in the next 10 years? What are we going for?
And Jay, you go first.
This is a really tough question, I guess. I mean, because I work as a software engineer, particularly developing design software and design tool for the designers. So in that context, I guess designers in 10 years, I guess, they're gonna have really a significant change, I guess. Because the design previously, we basically, people can think based on their intuition or experience to develop their idea, right? To produce something or draw something, right? I think this is a very conventional way of doing, some creative exercise. But I guess in 10 years, I guess, is I guess the social focus is more about like, how we take advantage of the data, which is the living in the digital world. It's not a real world. So many people talk about metaverse and in artificial intelligence, and there's a VR or AR or mixed reality. I mean, all happening in the digital world, I guess. Because the reason I guess the digital world just become like exposed is because there's no sort of bottleneck effect in the real world, right? Because I mean, compared to the real world, I think the digital world cannot be really quickly evolve, and then it's really, you need a short time to deploy something. But as I mentioned, in the digital world, the most important resource is the data. So I think the question becomes like how designer take advantage or deal with the data, I guess. So I have no idea right now, but I just saw something from the Neil's presentation. It's more about like how architect or designers need to interact with the information which live in the digital world, I guess. So also the data is sort of a different representation of the fact that we have, like an environment, a different sort of facade or section of our world. So for example, like the reason why Amazon rely on the data for displaying their purpose products is because the data is basically collective intelligence from the individual human being based on their hobby or age or gender or culture. They have their own preference. The data is basically representing this kind of the fact as a numeric number. So I guess the most important things for the architecture for the future is to prepare how we how to take advantage of how to deal with the information as a resource for your design. I think this is the most important change, I guess, because most of the designers, they're used to dealing with the physical material, even if they are familiar with some software program like a Rhino or Photoshop or things like that, but still, this is very generic tool. It's really hard to manipulate the data directly. So I think how designer deal with the data directly without any help. I mean, so these are the answer, I guess, and question for designers in 10 years. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, it's I've been in this like path of actually very much curious about funding opportunities that would actually allow the work to be visible and be heard. And one of the reasons, so I only showed the work that I've been doing with air quality, but since starting at FIU, we've been doing series of works with FIU Institute of Environment focused on water quality issues. And a lot of the work is really not completed yet. I'll be able to share that in coming months, but we're using similar techniques, but there we're able to actually present to policymakers and, organize an event where we take the mayor on a boat ride, but then while he's there, we're able to kind of sneak in a couple of visualizations and talk to him about, certain issues that are, like, let's say, addressing the city. One of the biggest issues that I've come across is the fact that this type of visualization work is quite specific to the audience that you're actually to a specific audience. It's very difficult to create work that is bridging, let's say, that could appeal to scientists, but also it could appeal to the general public. So it's been my dream to create a visualization or a platform that would appeal to all. And I've done a couple of attempts, but I don't think it's been successful. Because let's say scientists are looking for a very different thing. And actually from your program, UCSB, Basak Alper has been somebody that's been quite successful actually bridging that gap. And now she works for JPL and creating visualization tools. But all her work have been either very much focused towards, let's say, kids in schools or let's say scientists, right? So really understanding that, understanding your audience and scope of the work and creating visualization for that is really, really fundamental. So that's been a kind of a sobering realization that that's something that you need to define. But then along with that, especially with general public, you need incredible amount of funding if you want this work to be visible. But also for me, that's a very interesting curiosity, and it gets into like bureaucratic aspect of how, let's say, maybe academia is set up, but at the same time, I'm very much interested in creating work that it could ultimately in 5 years, 10 years, contribute to policies. And I feel like understanding how the inner workings happen, and at the same time, how, let's say, a visualization could make it to the desk of somebody that's making a policy is really important. Because ultimately, if you think about the way that building standards were set up, if you go back to Hugh Ferris and his drawings of New York setbacks or other zoning laws, these are created using visualization, right? So that one map of USC that I showed, which we identified that one corner being highest polluted, and that was due to light duration. Maybe that's maybe that's quite obvious, but it's not until you have the visualization that you can get somebody's attention, and that could potentially change policy. So, so in a sense, I'm very much interested in the work that could attract people's attention. That you could provide feedback, engage people, but at the same time, it could lead to some analysis and correlations that could lead to policy. So,
well,
yeah.
No, just to follow up, I mean, I think I'm looking at you both, and I think I'm very thankful for Neil. He's putting you on a platform to be future leaders of the field, right? So let's say, you know, Elon Musk wants to give each one of you $1 billion. What is your vision of architecture? I think really what Neil in this course has done is really made me think about the role of architecture. And it's so alive that the definition is moving within time. So in my program, I was the architect on the team, meeting with material scientists, physicists, and mathematicians, and they had different notions and understanding of space. But to make their discoveries, there needed to be an understanding of what space is physically, what space is theoretically, and then mentally, so that they could interrogate the data and to see if it's real or not. So I think with you both, I'm going, these people are the future of the field. So what is architecture for you, and how does it change with your research?
Maybe I could draw on the example that I showed. For me, I mean, transition from architecture to media arts was quite sobering, and understanding that actually how the slowness of our field, architecture, and fastness of let's say real-time graphics fields or media fields, right? And then understanding that there is definitely possibility in bridging that, right? So some people like Refik Anadol do that by, you know, transforming facades. Some people do that by proposing interactive carts. But it goes back to, I guess, two things. One was the comparison image of Parc de la Villette that I showed before Pokemon Go and after Pokemon Go, and how Shumi's event spaces were only maybe finally realized when there was a media overlay, which was done, you know, in a very kind of Tesla manner, with software update. You know, you're able to then maybe still use an old hardware. So this kind of constant overlaying and contribution by people, how that could be interesting. And at the same time, maybe it goes back to also the way that I would say, sorry, I lost my train of thought. I had a second thought.
No, I'm not here to put you. I'm not here to put you on the spot. It's just, Neil, it's challenging the way, like in Yesterday in Digital Futures, the death of culture, or, you know, the death of architecture is the last one in the series. You know, architecture for me is so alive. I think we can metaphorically say architecture can be found in nature and animals, and you know, in people. But right. You know, architecture changes us. The data changes us, and we're now changing architecture at a slower time scale. So yeah. That's why I think I'm trying to identify how is your research really encapsulating all those concepts.
Yeah, and this is something that it goes back to, I remember the Dietmar Offenhofer's and Carlo Rotti's Decoding the City, the fact that you know, we are able to make more accurate decisions, but these are going to be short-term decisions, right? So a short-term decision is a year, 4 years. Can we afford, with current, you know, lack of resources and environmental issues, to rebuild architecture that's only gonna withstand 4 years? Maybe that's a completely different way of thinking about materiality. Maybe this is where you know, interactive architecture could be rethought. I'm not so interested in, and I've done a lot of also interactive pieces as well with students, and also applied projects, mainly in New York. I'm not sure if I'm interested in that yet. I think it's, at least for my work, it would be quite premature to assume what this would be. And I'm not even sure if I'm interested in doing that in my research, at least for the next couple of years. I'm quite comfortable saying that that's not something I'm focusing on right now, and I would be quite uncomfortable speculating about something, prematurely. But I think again, this idea of just matching maybe temporality and spatiality is going to be quite important, because the fact that right now we're in the process of migrating from GPS to VPS, which is visual positioning system, which is completely going to change the way that we're creating worlds and translating worlds. It's going to completely change augmented reality and mapping of the environment. With the past year that we've had, understanding that actually virtual maybe teleportation, there's value, and maybe again environmentally could be beneficial. We all saw how gases were reduced in the beginning state of pandemic because there was less transportation. I'm not sure. I don't see I definitely don't see Jetsons or anything of that sort yet, and I think that's okay for now. Thanks.
I have one sort of opinion toward your question. I guess this is also one of my worry, in my opinion, because even if I work as a software engineer, my background was architectural designer, and I love design. I fascinating understanding environment to build something in the physical world. But the something I experience in this day is, this is a little bit weird question and experience, because UI UX designer has a more powerful impact on build our modern society compared to the architect. Just think about like star architects. They build some design, and then normal people have no idea how to appreciate the building, right? Only architecture students, they talk about like criticize the building space, yeah. But think about like a metaverse, for example. I couldn't remember, but several months ago, famous musicians like BTS, they have a concert in the metaverse, and the UC Berkeley, the commencement, like the things is happening in the Minecraft world. Billion people from the world, they actually located in the same place, right? And then they enjoy the concert and celebrate the commencement, right? Even now, think about ourselves. We are not gathering in the physical class. We just open the computer, yeah, and then we can just connect to the Zoom meeting, and then it's absolutely different than the normal that we already had, right? That architect designed the space or human behavior, right? So my worry is, as I mentioned, like UI UX designer in Silicon Valley, they have a more fund and money and power to give the actual impact for human ordinary life that architectural design in the previous century or before COVID-19, for example. I think that this question is actually a really important question. Then I guess to answer your question, how I vision, how I prepare for that future is that possibly, as I mentioned, the range of tools is still gonna be different. Yeah. So rather than making some model or designing something and visualizing the shape to the people and describe how human emotion gonna be changed, how interpret our perception of the space. But rather than talk about these kind of things, the tool and the material that we rely on is going to be different. Like a data is intangible, right? So we need to learn the code, how to program, how to create the algorithm to tweak and to cook the material. It's not about the concrete. It's not about the timber. It's more about like an invisible numeric data which representing some, I don't know, facts or some insight. This is a little bit different things. But software engineer, UI UX people, they're more familiar with dealing with this kind of material to design something in physical, in not only physical world, because they also talk about like how to touch, how to gesture, how to think about the interface to connect between real people and the physical world and digital world. I mean, this kind of exercise and think is a really imminent problem that architects need to start think, I guess. Otherwise, the most, otherwise in 10 years, UI UX people, they're gonna be replaced the architect, the responsibility, I guess. This is, I think, pretty, I don't know, this is my role too. I mean, one of my job is to, insight and push designer to learn code. Yeah, how to design their algorithm to generate the space in physical in digital world. I think this is that's why I have a little bias on it. So I guess to answer your question is stop and rethink this kind of change, and then we think about like how we prepare for the imminent future that gonna change dramatically. So these are sort of my concern and opinion about your question.
Maybe I could just, so just there were some also questions in the chat that sort of raised this kind of issue, almost like there's a it seems to me that kind of central issue for architecture itself is to reposition itself. And one of the problems that I've seen over the past has been kind of like the divided culture, what C.P. Snow calls it, the two cultures between arts and sciences. And what we've seen, at least let me speak from my personal perspective, what I've seen is a kind of like an oscillation between these two domains. I studied in Cambridge not so long after John Fraser was teaching there, and there was a whole kind of culture of looking at computation and things. But that when I was there, the swing was the other way. It was towards the kind of like the kind of arts and culture side of things, and almost a dismissal of what was going on in terms of computer science and even engineering. The School of Architecture, there was no connection with the School of Engineering, even though there were some amazing people like Christina Shea working on using computational structures. Likewise, there was a research center called the Martin Center that had no connection at all, and and in fact, computers were banned from the studio, and that's to my mind is really unhealthy. And all the intellectual work was going on. It actually, Sylvia was kind of alluding to yesterday. Was going on in the kind of history theory area, like people like Anthony Vidler, Kenneth Frampton, Joseph Rickford, and so on. And that was great, but I think that divide was really unproductive. And I think what people like Manuel Delander have done really importantly is to open up the idea that actually that the area of technology can be theorized and needs to be theorized. So in some ways, it seems to me we need to kind of overcome that particular divide. If you go back to the Renaissance, I mean, if you look at the kind of things that Alberti was writing about, it seems, it was a very holistic vision whereby the technology was completely part of that kind of cultural view. Equally, Leonardo da Vinci and things, those guys, that there was not a big divide. So to my mind, the key question is that divide itself. We've got a couple of questions from the chat. I don't know whether G, you'd like to ask your question.
Okay, I can ask quickly. Thank you for your great presentation for NJ and Dianna. My question is more practical. From your workflow, I saw you are absorbing data from the current city or a certain environment and using a way to visualize these data. Are there any sample or ideas for a brand new area, a new plan, similar to one use Xcode project, but are there any other possibilities? Thank you.
Are you talking about in terms of platforms for data visualization or data sources?
I mean, your workflow is absorbing data from a existing city or a environment. I'm wondering what could AI or computational design could act or respond to a new area, a brand new area, empty space. Not absorbing data from this environment. Am I clear?
Yeah, I don't know. My understanding of your question is about like what is something special that we never experienced, right? By dealing with data visualization or computational approach for design, I think. But I guess, yeah, I actually receive this kind of question a lot from the designers. But I guess my answer to that question is the computation design or data-driven design or visualization is just tool. It's a way of dealing with the material that I mentioned. So previously we, concrete or glass or plastic, these are kind of materials affect the design world a lot, right? So every time the brand new sort of material introduced to design world, designer think about tool, how to cook the material, right? This is, I think, the healthy perspective toward see the computational approach, which is unfamiliar with for designers, I guess. So as I mentioned, we have the other material called data. So in order to cook the data for your design, what kind of tool do we have right now? The tool is more about like a algorithmic thinking, like a computational thinking, like you can create some algorithm or code, and then you need to visualizing. Otherwise, there's no way to see the result out of a computer. Yeah, so these are sort of a process material. It's not about like a new domain, I guess. This is just a tool. And then in terms of the domain, I think you can just use this kind of tool based on your purpose or I guess your design process, I guess. But in terms of, I don't know, maybe AI or computational design approach, they're basically different focus of how dealing with the cook, dealing with the data, I guess. So to answer your question, I guess, I believe it's not about like something special in domain. It's more about like a thinking process and methodology to dealing with the data, which is brand new material for in modern society, I guess. So yeah, I don't know whether it correct answer to your question or not, but yeah, this is the one thing in my mind to share.
But I think maybe for me, it's a little bit difficult to think about operating in vacuum because even if you go to a site and there's nothing there, you as an observer, you already have some objectives that you might want to not so much impose, but question, right? So starting from a design question is often quite important. So is the focus about optimization? Is the focus on translation? And I in a sense, I refuse to think about AI as this foreign thing. I really that just the conversation about AI and creativity, I think it's quite interesting, but I still look at it as basically a tool for decision making. And we know the expression garbage in, garbage out, right? We know that all the conversations about biases of the initial database. So I don't think still we're ever starting from vacuum, right? Unless it's more of a tool exploration. I think this workflow of data processing, data input, processing, and data output, it applies in every scale, whether you're using a simple grasshopper definition or let's say even XSchool, they are working with parameters, even if they are starting on an empty site. There's budget, there's site, there's always these variables. So for me, it's very difficult to kind of imagine exploration that's either not content specific, design question specific, or software specific.
Maybe I could just ask another question. I think it's thank you so much for these presentations. I wasn't so familiar with Namjoo's work. It's really mind-blowing. It's fantastic. He kind of strikes me as like he takes the term architect, and it's both architecture and the computer science thing and also in the architectural sort of sense. My question though is like, I mean, there are two routes to go. We discussed this when we were talking about offices in the future. One is to use AI and use any of these technologies to make life simpler, like just facial recognition, swiping, and so on. And then one is to dig deep and to go like Namjoo does, or Daniel or Dianna and many others, to go really into it and to learn to code. Now, what is the vision? Is it going to be both of those, or do we all have to learn to code in the future? Do all students have to learn to code?
Namjoo has this incredible channel. I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, I think I don't know. I mean, from my experience, I set up my NJ Studio 2004. At that time, the reason I was able to set up the company is because not many people can do some 3D design. Even if the architect, they actually use the pencil to draw the elevation section rather than like a 3D sketch, things like that. But after 10 years, 2010, my experience is the academic world and practice. A lot of people not only do 3D design, but also they can take advantage of the VR, AI for the visualization, and also some people can code, right? Like using the Grasshopper, like a visual programming language, I guess. But I have a nephew and niece. They attended the elementary school. They actually learned the code, how to code, like using the Scratch, developed by MIT. And also, I highly encourage him to learn the Python language because, so think about like how fast computer, I guess. In the pro gamer, they actually make a 300 action per minute. They're like a really professional gamer, yeah, which is very faster than I thought actually. But to think about the neural engine in iPhone, it's not about the special computer. It's just like a cell phone in your hand. It's like in a second, they've done like 1 trillion computation. I guess the reason why we need to learn the code is not about something, special, but more about like how to, take advantage of the speed of the computing power. Yeah. I mean, the neural network, deep neural network, the idea was already set up like several decades ago. But the reason why the reason the people really talk about the revitalizing the neural network is because thanks to computation power recently, like a parallel computing. So what I'm saying is there's a lot of tools. The question becomes like how to use the tool for the design process. I mean, the Rhino tool or Rabbit, these are like too generic to customize your design process. So some people ask me, why design need to code, But my answer is to customize your design process, to automate. Basically, computer is some of your employee in your computer in digital world. It's not about like making something, just like creating your own employee based on the design issue. So for example, like I have some friends or my PE in our company, they actually give us like some design question, design issue. So rather than resolving the design issue directly, I'm thinking about how can I educate the computer or how to set up the algorithm to resolve this problem. Yeah, it's more about like a little bit different thinking process in order to take advantage of the current tool. I mean, think about like 20 years or 30 years ago, we need to spend a lot of time to make sure for the people who have no idea about the computer or Rhino or AutoCAD, but we need to educate them why we need this kind of tool. But recently, these days, no one actually reject why we need to learn this kind of technology, right? The same as the code. I think the code is gonna be a really essential and basic sort of let's say language, just like mathematics, English or Japanese or Korean or Chinese. It's like a language to communicate with the computer, which has a lot of power, a lot of resources. They're never bored. They just do whatever they need as long as they have some energy, like electricity power. I think this is the statement why designer need to prepare for coding this in order to dealing with the data, which is brand new material, I guess, compared to the past.
We have a question in the chat from Elena. Can we talk about individualism of residents and freedom in brain smart cities? And what about economic and physical violence by vigilantes, corporations, and government who will own the data? For example, based on environmental studies, one day all cars will be prohibited, and so on. I don't know if anyone wants to address that question.
I mean, I think obviously it's impossible to talk about data without talking about ownership, without talking about sharing models, and without talking about the power that it inherently has, right? And I think it's quite exciting to see that surveillance capitalism book by Shoshana Zuboff has been quite important in the past years, and what kind of she talks about in terms of not only we need to know what we're extracting, but who decides, and then who decides, right? So these questions are impossible to answer in some cases, but also they're incredibly important for us to constantly think about and begin to address. I'm going to talk about one example that we had when we were working with City of Seoul for the Biennale in 2017. We were working on this app, and the overall app development took us about 2 months. But the conversation with the government to have access to air quality data, and in this case, air quality in a lot of cities have been very political. In this case, the way that China and Korea for many years have, in a sense, have this crisis of air quality, and for many years, Korea was blaming China for all its pollution. However, you can only do that so much, and at some point, as a country, as a city, you have to do something. And the mayor that was selected before the Biennale, one of his promises was that he was going to address this thing called the yellow dust, which is actually a combination of gases, and which particulate matter was a very big component of that. And that was like one of the winning, in a sense, bids that worked for him. So therefore, we were able to leverage that kind of conversation with the city to even say, hey, we were doing this project, then get the Biennale people involved and begin to ask for data. Now, after all of that, it took about 6 good months just to be able to access the data. It required, let's say, local phone number, passport number, etc., just to be able to have access to the data, right? We were successful to do that, but as I said, just a data acquisition part. In this case, we didn't even have to do the collection for that component, just negotiation with the government. There was a political component. There was, the kind of a national, let's say, issue between China and Korea, and we had to leverage so many different things just to access the data. And at the end, it was an Excel spreadsheet with 30 years of data, right? So the same thing happens, let's say, in the United States when Barack Obama made a big statement with creating the data hubs and making it public. At the same time, when Trump was, let's say, elected, there was all this kind of fear that EPA data was going to disappear. So like there was this hackathons that everybody organized, and let's say I participated and a bunch of people participated, and we were able to, extract data before they disappeared. And actually EPA website was down for a while after the election. So yeah, it's really it's a very nuanced topic, and in this case I'm only talking about environmental issues where in theory anybody could have a sensor still on their home and acquire this. Obviously, then we're talking about things that have to do with people's data and privacy. This is then an impossible layer that's introduced. So same thing when you're doing research that is using biometric data or people's data, then there's kind of this incredible layers that one needs to go through. Unfortunately, there's not that many solutions yet, but at least something that's hopeful or beginning is that in institutions, they are starting to set up these training programs, these protocols that you cannot publish unless you're able to do A, B, and C, or you cannot share this information, or you must share the information. So it has to be like a combination of top-down and bottom-up policies in order for us to just begin to understand complexity of the issues, because it's not only a new issue, but also we're dealing with a lot of different data types with many different, let's say, privacy and proprietary issues.
But what about also social credit system? Aren't we losing our freedom with this? Because, for example, by afraid to lose, for example, ability to travel, we would think, what should we go to liquor store, or should we spend blah 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 number of money? So it's also data, and also the sensing information, as you spoke before, in environment, they can stop prohibiting or limiting people.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that actually there's this great book, I forgot the author's name, it's called Urbanism on Track, and it talks about like history of tracking. Let's say first tracking or census, which was taking place in a village in, I forgot the name, but in Austria. And it was first time where, let's say street or house numbers were assigned to houses, and it was for them to collect taxes, right? So data, let's say acquisition has always been affiliated with control and surveillance. And right now we cannot even think about a world without, house number, without home addresses, right? It's just something that we're not even thinking about. Maybe we're not going to share it publicly, but it's public knowledge and it could be accessed, right? So it is true that over time we're becoming more and more jaded. But the fact that, that was just a way to locate people, and there was a time where people didn't have addresses, right now it's just beyond comprehension. So with China's, health code that were introduced during COVID-19, and then all this ambiguous back and forth that happened in European countries about whether to track or not to track, and consent or not to consent, I think all of this is the reality. And yeah, unfortunately, I don't know. It's just the only thing I can think about is work of activists that are trying to highlight this. Yeah, without kind of making, I guess, policymakers aware of this, or catch up. It's quite incredible how accelerated just in the past year tracking technologies have become.
And I'm curious, do you see implementation of brain system into European countries, for example? Because if we'll go back to example of COVID, right, how they fighted this in China. So, but we also have to think about the mentality organization, of all countries. And China, for example, it's more community oriented, right? They're all like more communal. And Europe and Western civilizations are more individual. And when they start to implement the same rules like they implemented in Asia, we saw it's all over the news, protests and angry people. So do you see this implementation of brain system data sensing policies in Western countries? Besides Scandinavian, of course, they also start to do this, like in Norway, Sweden, but it's more on sustainable level, and they don't collect that much data like Asian countries do, that aggressively.
NJ, do you want to take this on? I don't know if you want to tackle on your experience in Korea, or on tracking and data collection.
Yeah, the presentation that I showed you for the solo renovation project. Yeah, there was nothing special. We relying on some the open source of data, which is Instagram, right? And Instagram has not only picture, as a sort of the imagical representation of what people want to perceive or share, right? At the same time, they leave some texture, the paragraph or text as to encapsulate their emotion or some information to share, right? So this is very interesting because sometimes we can interchangeably understand what people want to share, and how people understand and appreciate or perceive the space in that exhibition. So at that time, we have actually two tracks. One track is a technical approach that I did, pass the information and basically rebuild, sort of interpret the design from the people as a bottom-up approach. And then Dong-Se Kim, he's as I mentioned, like a assistant professor in NIT. He actually starting from the policy and the local government, like a Seoul government, they actually spend money, and they have a goal to while they revitalizing the street. And his range is more about like how we interpret and then how we evaluate the design at the end of the day by looking at how citizens react the design. So some is the correlate, some is there's some people that don't like it. I mean, because individual citizen has their own perspective and interpretation, and then they actually maximize their sort of the emotions throughout their Instagram or internet. So I think what's your question? I mean, by the way, so
my question was about implementation of the same policies like in Asia to Western civilizations.
So what does
Western? It's more still monocultural, and even for example, China, it's more community mind mentality. Mm-hmm. And Europe or United States, it's more individual and more diverse communities and residences. So
yeah, just jump into this to answer this question. It's probably not such as of Western or Eastern countries and their policies, but it's becoming more a question of the companies like Google, Facebook, where they store all your data. So it's probably more a question that you have to ask these companies, and what are their rights to hold your information.
I mean, I just would chip in one thing here, and that is to say that some Western intellectuals, and not only Ben Bratton, but also Slavoj Žižek, have been pointing out maybe we need to rethink the kind of this very negative approach towards surveillance. In the context of COVID, it's important to be able to track that. I would also say, just from a kind of straightforward consumerist perspective, it's kind of nice to be reminded by Amazon or whatever it was of what I bought before, so I can run it in the future. I think the key question is to be aware of these things and to be aware of the problems on both sides. Do we have any? We need to sort of wrap up this discussion. I get the impression we could go on forever because it's actually super interesting topic. It's almost like a Pandora's box of issues that have been raised that needs to be really taken further in many ways, and I'm sure we will. Maybe I'll just I'll just finish with one comment, and that is to say, one thing that has been, to my mind, startling in just doing a little review back over the last few years is that in 2009. Bratton was talking about something that before even Uber had arrived, about the possibility of how we could work and the car could be part of how we work, and Dianna was mentioning that the big data only hit the scene in 2010. So that's, we're talking about the last 11, 12 years. And it seems to me that the whole discipline of architecture is going to be forced to address these things in a radically important way in the near future right now. And I think that what was so, and I'm really grateful to both Dianna and Namjoo for giving us this incredibly interesting and insightful overviews of the kind of tools that are going to begin to kind of colonize the way we operate as architects in the future. And it's a very dynamic and swiftly changing moment in history. And who knows where we'll be in another 11 or 12 years time from now. I don't know if there's any final sort of comments, but this has been a real eye-opener in a way, this session. It's really opened up a whole series of kind of questions. Final comments?
I have one comment. I mean, I really love this class. It was like amazing for me. I have like a lot of new things for my research. It was super useful even for my research here in the DDES. And I believe that one thing that Namjoo said about, for example, that there is like this language which is coding, and then all of us will, in a way, we need it in order. You said to teach in a way, and I'm also thinking like in a way the architectural figure today is more like a hacker architect in terms of how we are designing or trying to hack these existing systems. in terms to try to do what we continue want to do in a way, and how we use it. Sorry about my dog. There is always the problem. I'm sorry, but how we are in a way using them, or trying to hack in the system in order to continue design it as architects. But I also see there is like a lot of resistance in terms of like in a way like a kind of loss of disciplinary discussion, or there is like a certain idea that there is like a kind of loss of control from the architect in the process. And also there is also this kind of resistance in terms of what are going to do the architects who are not learning how to code, for example. What is going to be the professional futures in a way for this kind of architect? Because I believe that there is like a lot of I don't know, a lot of afraid about, or uncertainty about the future in terms of who is not trying to learn this kind of thing. So I believe that it will be a question, but I believe that now, because of the time, it could be like an open question. I'm going to let it there. But I believe that that's an important question. What is going to happen with who is not learning how to coding, and what is going to happen with the architectural future in terms of this interaction with this new language? I mean, it's not totally new, but in a way, it's there, not available for everyone.
Well, maybe a final comment. I mean, I think that information is the key thing, right? You've got to be informed about what's going on. And I think we've been talking about informational systems, but to be informed by these informational systems has been absolutely an incredible thing. This session today was amazing. And what I think is also kind of important is we're using this informational platform to disseminate this information out there. We're live streaming this, and people across the globe are able to access this. So, I always think that we have to sort of see these things in terms of technology, in terms of its social implications and so on. That was always the view of the Bauhaus, and hopefully by opening up in this way, to some extent, we are democratizing informational systems. I just want to say that, to finish up, really, really interesting session. I'm so glad to see your work, Namjoo, firsthand. I obviously know you and things, and it's great also to see an update on Dianna's fabulous work that's going on. This was really a really great discussion. We're coming to an end. We'll have to draw to a close, but I think I've said this before. This is just the beginning. I think that we've opened up a whole territory of investigation, and I'm sure this will be something that a hot topic that it already is, but I'm sure increasingly in architectural culture, we'll see this on the horizon. So thank you so much for your presentations, and thank you for the contributions of the audience. It really has been fantastic. Next week, we'll be looking at the question about material intelligence, which is more the intelligent use of materials, which goes alongside the intelligent use of immaterial materials. So anyway, thank you so much. And
thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.
Okay.
Bye.
Well, Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Happy New Year.
Yeah.
A lot. Thank you.